we start talking about having coffee and conversation with this one and that one, it's not really Beach Haven Neighborhood Watch. It's much, much larger than that. Building meaningful community is an idea that emerged, that is in my life, that is back in the 70s. It's a construct. It's something that you can work with. It's about turning to each other, not against each other. It's about taking a functional approach. It's about moving forward. It's about keeping in step, that is, with things in real time, such as science, etc. And so that's why we are attempting to get the best explanations, that is, of the facts, the best explanations, namely of the data. I mean, that would be nice, right? We want the best explanations of what's really going on in people's lives and who they are. Okay, let's give Glenn Conrad a big hand.
I don't know why you would do that. So this is turning out to be an absolutely wonderful forum tonight. Commissioner Valentino talked about government structure.
Step in this mic so they can hear.
Oh, okay. Commissioner Kohler and Mr. Kerb talked about infrastructure a good bit. By the way, I may want to follow up with you on some of the wetlands issues. I'm going to talk about the environment a little bit here. And I would argue that our local environment, economics, and quality of life are all related, okay, for one thing. Might have to bear with me just a second while I try to see what I'm doing here. I prepared a little something a while back. I took a Master Naturalist class, and I prepared a little report from that. We don't need to see that part. And I used the Navy Point area as an example of some of the shoreline and estuary issues in this. So this is a smorgasbord right now, and I probably won't go through the whole thing. I'll flip over a lot of the slides, but what I would offer up front is that if you're interested in this, there's some references, there's some links in the slides, in this presentation that work. I'll send it to you. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you can find out about. Pensacola, Escambia County now has this Pensacola and Perdido Bays Estuary Program. These are good people. They do wonderful work. They are collecting a body of references. So a library is coming up that goes back into even the 1800s about water quality and the environment in the Pensacola Bay area. So anyway, just a little tidbit there. So anyway, this talk briefly, shoreline and estuary characteristics, and perhaps if Michael will let me come back one day, I will tailor this specifically for the local area. But this is going to be a little bit more general. So a shoreline and estuary. Estuaries grow things. Estuaries grow shrimp. They grow the lower part of the food chain. They have environments where freshwater mixes with saltwater, and that means shrimp, crabs, crustaceans, small fish, recruitment, those kinds of things. And there's some impacts to that now. Storms, as Chris mentioned quite a bit, natural impacts. There's man-made impacts in terms of development and stormwater runoff. There's other natural impacts, which are mostly around here associated with major storms. So a little bit of history here. I'm going to take Gene Valentino's point to look back a little bit to see where we are now. So if you go down to the shoreline of Bayou Grande at sunset, and you look out there, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's gorgeous. We are so blessed to live here in this environment and see that. You see the sun reflecting off of the water, but you don't see what's not under the water. Okay? So, particularly looking in Bayou Grande, most of the residential development here, you can argue, really got cranked up in the mid-40s associated with the Naval Air Station for Navy training in World War II. That's when most of the houses were built. That's when most of the stormwater drains were put in. That's when, at the time, the technology of the day was septic tanks, which leach into a high water table. People didn't like bugs, so they put pesticides on their yard. People didn't like weeds, so they put herbicides on their yard. There's oil runoff from the roads. All of that mixes together when it rains. Gravity takes over and it runs into the nearest water body. And that's not just here. Took about 40 years from the mid-40s to the mid-80s, early 80s, to pretty much kill off all of the seagrasses, the estuaries that grow the shrimp and the crabs and the crustaceans and those kind of the lower end of the food chain, not just in the bayou here, but around the bay system. And that coincided a lot with the fish kills that we had in the late 70s and 80s. If any of you were here at that time, I'm a native. I grew up in the area. Okay, so some of these personal insights I'm going to try and mix in with some of the objectively verifiable references here in this briefing. So since then, since the 80s to the 2020s, we don't do those kind of things as much. We're doing more septic to sewer conversions. We're not putting as much pesticides on our yards. And nature is healing itself. It's beginning to. But the other aspect of helping nature to heal itself in these kind of coastal areas is now these living shorelines. That's the technology of today. NOAA, and this link works here on this, has done a tremendous amount of work. So on one side of this picture, the left side, you have what would be more of a natural living shoreline, maybe some hard substrate, some oysters, some plants on shore, some plants coming in. And on the other side, you have a seawall. That's a spectrum. Some are appropriate in different areas, from the greener, softer technologies to the harder techniques. This is an example from Sanders Beach, Florida. So overhead view up in the front, up in the top left here of this 1930s era house property. Lower left is the same view. So this seawall was built in about the 30s and not very well maintained. So you can see what happens over a period of time just from a seawall perspective with no living shoreline and a good bit of fetch and energy on the shore. Now this is just down the street from that site. The left side here where the red arrow goes down is Sally, where this was the day before Sally. You can look at that, nice green lawn, vertical seawall there on the shoreline. And the right side is the day after Sally. So nature generally changes slowly until it changes things very rapidly. That seawall stayed in place, but it was undermined behind it and it cost a lot to fix it. Another picture of the same thing. That's kind of pretty much the day after Sally or 2 days after Sally. So for restoration and resiliency, currently the habitat restoration, the living shorelines, or the technologies and the techniques of today. And again, this habitat blueprint, there's some references, some living shoreline projects around the East Coast and the Gulf. There's a lot of good information there. So let me focus locally now. Bayou Grande is kind of unique. Residential on the North Shore, Naval Air Station on the south, not a lot of industry. Might have been some industrial type activities from the Navy back in the 40s through the 60s, but not so much anymore. So right now, the things in red that you see are where there are actually oyster-based living shorelines that have been put in place, and they're not just around Navy Point, and some natural oyster areas. So why are oysters important here? Well, some people have realized that they've taken the NOAA research to heart and done it, and the living shorelines cover several issues: erosion on the shore, habitat, recreation and commercial value because they grow things, and water quality. So one of the examples of water quality comes from NOAA, and I'm not sure you can see this very well, but the references here, and I would, if you don't go to any link in this briefing, go to this one. So the picture on the left are 2 tanks, one with 10 oysters in them, and the one on the right with no oysters in them, and the one on the picture on the right is the same tank after the oysters have filtered the water for 59 minutes. It's a little bit clearer, okay? And this is peer-reviewed, research from NOAA. There's been a lot more of this done up in the Chesapeake area than here, but this is a very good example of why this kind of living shoreline infrastructure is important. Now, it's not appropriate everywhere. Project Green Shores downtown near the Bay Bridge uses big rocks because it's a higher energy shoreline. Waves are bigger. There's a lot longer distance for the waves to build up before they hit that shore, okay? Ask Sanska, they know about that. I'm only halfway being facetious there. So that's why they expanded the Project Green Shores further down, because those 3 barges were laying up against the road. So now the living shoreline provides a buffer against some of the erosion and some of the water sea level rise. But in this area, in the bayou, where there's not that much of a wind fetch to build energy up against the shoreline, things like oysters, smaller rocks are appropriate. Doesn't mean they're the best thing in every case, but probably for here they're pretty good, especially given the fact that they help filter the water and give you better water quality, which is the basis of everything else in the estuary. And these are some pictures from Navy Point. Doesn't seem to affect much in the areas where there's recreation and wildlife. I've actually seen some redfish showing up now in Navy Point after a few years of those shorelines. Erosion. So here's 3 pictures. The one on the left is part of the Navy Point Trail, not where there is any of the living shoreline reefs. But you can see the gap in the concrete that has broken there as the shoreline has eroded over time. The top right picture is Gibbs Point. That was after Sally. Before Sally, there was sand all the way up to that. So major events are going to be an issue pretty much no matter what you do around any shoreline, okay? The bottom right picture is another area in Navy Point where you can see that the shoreline has eroded. Again, not where there's living shoreline in front of it to stop the erosion. And that pine tree is going to die. There's several that have been gone. But there's good news. So now, unlike 4 years ago, you can go down to Bayou Grande and seine up some shrimp, some crabs. The upper right picture is a sole, small sole. That's my hand, basically. And the lower right picture is what's called a tonguefish. So there's beginning to get to be more marine life observed there, partly because of this estuary improvement and the resilience. So there's a smattering of stuff in here from the naturalist program, but looking at the area, setting the context there, if you look at Bayou Grande, there's not much less than a mile of wind fetch in any direction, not very deep. One of the things here, though, and I'm not a biologist, I didn't even sleep in a Holiday Inn last night. I'm more of a physics type person, but largely if you have a predominantly southeast facing shoreline and counterclockwise rotation of hurricanes and major storms, that southeast facing shoreline, if that storm makes landfall to the west, you're in the teeth of the strongest wind. You're in the bad side of that storm. And that's the north shore of Bayou Grande. So you can see places that have been eroded right through some of those living shorelines. Navy Point's a nice microcosm of some of this to study because there's marshes, there's beaches, there's creeks, there's some upland stuff there. So a couple of years ago, I went around, took a bunch of data points and tried to measure the ability for the shore to recede and erode, and also try to measure seagrasses. The seagrass beds, that were there everywhere when I was growing up, which went away by the 1980s, are beginning to come back. Now it's mostly widgeon grass and not the shoal grass and the turtle grass that was there before, but they're beginning to come back. The water quality is improving somewhat. I found that my technique didn't work because you just can't measure things very well for a patch of grass that may recede or grow 2 or 3 feet with an instrument like a GPS that is roughly got about a 7-foot resolution. So that wasn't very good. So you need to be able to look at it from overhead. Some of the people that were the water quality people, Daryl Boudreau, likes to fly a drone over places and make good measurements of those kinds of things. Although you can't do it here because you're under the terminal control area for NAS Pensacola, and they don't like to have any drones flying that can hit airplanes, which is understandable. Anyway, so some of the local area observations here, another little example of some shoreline stuff. I'm going to skip through some of these. But so here's an image from some of the history from 1999, black and white, probably taken from an aircraft, and an image from 2002, which may have been a satellite image, I don't know. But you can see some of the differences. But what's interesting, if you look closely along the shoreline here, there's still a few piers around Navy Point. You know, I can think of there were 6 or 7 when I was growing up, and they jutted right out into the grass beds. So here we look at January 2018, just before the Navy Point living shoreline was installed. And these are the blue dots here are GPS points that I took as reference points. And you can see Gibbs Point here, how it's rounded off. Not much seagrass along the shoreline if you look very carefully. I guess you guys can't see that, can you? No. But then you jump forward to 2019. This is after the shoreline had been installed for a while, and you can see the small oyster-based, oyster-bagged shell reefs in there, and some of the land encroaching out to the reefs, which is not entirely a good thing. But you can see where some of the beaches have expanded out a little bit, from here to here on, say, like the bottom right part of the picture. So there's some benefits here. Another one, again, some of my historical observations. The areas in blue used to be covered in seagrass. There were shrimp there, crabs, you know. This was a vibrant estuary. They're mostly not there now, okay? So current submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, is in smaller patches, but it is coming back. It's beginning to come back. This is a good thing. So anyway, this is about wraps this up, but I'd offer this up to anybody that wants it. The links are good. I've got a whole bunch of references. If you Google the estuary program, they have a library going forward. Some of it's a little tedious reading, but it's well worth it to understand our environment and to make it so that, you know, we have clean water to swim in again. We have clean water to fish in again. We have clean water, period, which is a good thing. So anyway, questions, anything I can hit on? I'll get off the stage. Yes?
A lot of the problems that we're having is septic tanks, right?
Well, that's...
Unmaintained septic tanks.
I would say, now this is just my opinion, okay? I don't think there's anything wrong with septic tanks as long as there is enough vertical separation from the water table and horizontal separation from where that effluent is going to eventually run. Okay, but yes, you're right. Unmaintained septic tanks, the leach field degrades, you know, things go out, you get more raw sewage. It mixes with rainwater, stormwater, and everything else that hits the ground. Gravity takes it and runs it into the nearest water body. That's a problem over time. Fertilizers, pesticides. If there's a lot of mammal excrement, you know, that's where you get I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, enterococcus, you know, which will make you sick. Now that's very different. Another thing that's brought up a lot of times in these is Vibrio as a different bacteria, but Vibrio is a naturally occurring bacteria that happens here all the time. And you can look at the Florida State Health Department websites and see how many Vibrio samples they've got in cases. That's entirely different from a pollution-based enterococcus pollutant.
Well, another thing too, I mean, septic tanks that are not maintained, but our old aging infrastructure, when we have floods, those floods overload our sanitary sewer systems because you have infiltration into, a very good example is right there at Bruce Beach on South Village.
Sure.
Your roadway, I mean,
Sure.
you have to have a major rain event. The road goes underwater and you got manholes there and water goes into the manholes and the system is overloaded. And, that's one of my neighborhoods, Gloria Horning. I think you know Dr. Gloria.
I've met her, yes.
And you know, and yes, the city and ECUA is looking at this and trying to come up with solutions, but they're doing this.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
You know, it's like, no, that's a city problem. No, that's the ECUA problem.
So
And that happens a lot in government.
So-
We need to work together.
So maybe Michael will let me come back and address some things like that at another time, but I don't want to, because that's the proverbial 3-beer conversation, okay? All right. But now one of the things though, Chris, that is very good about that area down there though, is that I think it's Coran Jones Park that's just north of there, which is now a natural stormwater treatment area for some of that drainage. And of course there's still Washerwoman's Creek that flows into there. And you know, these things are getting better. Okay, so I don't want to be the Debbie Downer up here, because over my lifetime, especially recently, things are getting a little better. We are getting better. We're getting smarter. We have better, a little bit better government. Not a little bit better, Michael, but you know, but we have people that are interested in it anyway, and it is improving. But now's not the time to stop. And an example. So 15 years ago, how many shrimp boats did you see out in Pensacola Bay at night?
How many, like, shrimp boats?
A
A lot.
lot, yeah. 15, 20. You know, you see the lights out there all over the bay. How many do you see now?
None.
0. You know, most of the shrimp that you go down to Joe Patty's and buy are farm raised and come out of Central America. Because they don't grow here anymore, because we don't have the estuaries to produce them anymore. So it's worth it for economics, for recreation. And what eats shrimp? Speckled trout, redfish, you know, the list is long of a thing that does that. So this is an important topic. So anyway, here tonight, I'm very thankful you guys let me talk, followed on some of the government structure issues, followed on some of the infrastructure issues that we're working, which is good, and tie in a little bit of some of the environmental issues. And this goes across the bay. But subject to any other questions, we're done.
You didn't get to sing the other night when we were doing karaoke.
Michael,
So,
if I sang, no one would sleep tonight.
but
If you slept, you'd have nightmares.
okay, I'm not going to ask you to sing a cappella. I just want you to get up and tell 2 of your best jokes, and then you can sit down.
Are there any Marines in the room? You know how Marines count? 1, 2, many. Okay, this is a little bit more racy. Are there any Air Force people in the room? Okay, you know how a fighter pilot makes love? No? Same way they fly. Fast, alone, or with a guy in the back.
And the only way that we can have conversations that allow the passion that we want is through values. What kind of values? I'll tell you. How about civility, compassion, respect, empathy? enjoy the kind of music I'm playing, which combines and balances the idea of thoughtful notes, mindful execution, and passion. I think you're at the right place.